Hey, Pat.
Go ahead now, Paul.
All right, thank you, Robert, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce and welcome our speaker. Our speaker is Eric Scott, who is the son of Glen and Bunny Scott. Bunny happens to have been my mother's cousin, so therefore that makes Eric and myself second cousins. His father went to KU to work on his PhD after retirement, and so we happened to be classmates briefly. I was working on my master's and he was working on his PhD. And I found him most admirable because he really went to school just so he could get his PhD because he wanted those credentials by which to help him with his study of the Book of Mormon. And he earned his PhD from KU and wrote this rather remarkable book, which I'll put in front of you in hopes that you can actually see the title. It is Voices from the Dust, a New Light on the Ancient American Record. Now, his son Eric leads the Sunday roundtable. Just last Sunday was the roundtable at the Stone Church class. Other Sunday afternoons is typically just a Book of Mormon class, but he has been leading that for some time, and so it's a class that some of us drive quite a few miles in order to be able to participate in. A class of 30 or so people, and for him to agree and to come, I really wanted his father to come and present, but Glenn got old and not not really able to hear and see that well, and so he has moved to the other side, moved to the next dimension, and Eric has agreed to come and take his place and give us a review of this remarkable book and his father's study, as well as, I hope, some of his own findings as well. Eric's career as a business consultant has given him a passion to help people achieve goals. And that's something those of us in the quest for Zion may want to listen to carefully. And Eric, I thank you very much for joining us this evening. It is a pleasure to have members of the family show up with qualifications, credentials, and a significant presentation. Let us pray together. Awesome enigma of the universe, to whom we look for guidance in our quest for the promised land. You have touched our lives with enlightenment, like when the jaredite stones were touched by your hand. To cross the deep and darkness, no, you have provided us the light of your Son, to fulfill a plan of enlightenment, an eternal promise to everyone. And yet we struggle in our sonder, wandering at the outcomes as on our journey we face strife. Daily needing guidance, nudges toward the goal of eternal life. For our world faces daily dilemma. We face conflict, hate, and war. Enough that we seek safety in our traditions, some of which keep us spiritually poor. Yet you assure us that your hand is stretched out still to guide our quest when we offer our best, our integrity and goodwill. This evening, we ask for your spirit to bless our presenter, Eric Scott, and our participants to explore together as you have taught. That we ask, seek, knock, looking for the truth, to pass on as our journey's legacy to the next generation, our youth. That they appreciate your guidance, your touch, the gentle nudging of your hand to help them fulfill the intellecti of the eternal promised land. We pray in the name of the Christ, whose hand nudges us every day toward the arc of history's sacred hoop, in this and in every land. Amen. All right. Whoop. I ended the show and that got me out too far, I'm afraid. Eric, the floor is yours if we have solved the audio and visual problems.
We're still not hearing you.
Well, and I have lost significant contact here. I don't know what's happened. I shut down something I shouldn't have.
I'll stop your screen share, Paul.
Thank you. Hey, thank you. That brought me back.
There you go.
All right. There I see Terry, and Spencer, and Kathy, and Alice, and Kenneth, and Carol, and Shane. And Eric, I see, but I don't hear.
So Eric, down in your lower left-hand corner where you have the microphone, there's that little arrow that points up. Click on that. It gives you some options for selecting a microphone or selecting a speaker. Do you see that? It says you're connecting to audio now.
That's a good sign.
Maybe.
As another preliminary note, ladies and gentlemen, I would call to your attention that Ben and I, on occasion, had a chance to discuss, and one of the places where we had agreement, and I'm going to find that it made it into his book, was on the date, the significance of the date for the beginning of the Olmec calendar. And I suspect Eric will cover that, but the fact that Glenn and I had a chance to discuss that, and I found it fascinating that the Olmec calendar gave us a specific date as to when it began, some 3,113 or 14 BC. And Glenn has included that in his book and identified why he thinks that specific date was chosen as the base of the Olmec calendar.
Hey, Eric.
Can you hear me yet?
Yay, yes, we can.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well,
If everybody would mute themselves except for Eric, then just to be sure everybody's muted, then we can go ahead and proceed. Thank you.
I hear you all well. I'm not going to worry with my picture right now as long as you can hear me.
Right, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Well, let me begin. Paul already gave me a bit of an introduction. My father was a serious Book of Mormon student, as many of you are, I suppose. He taught Book of Mormon classes in over 3 states. He taught Book of Mormon classes wherever he went to church. People have asked me if I had any specific testimonies to the Book of Mormon, and my answer is my father told me it was true, and I believed him. I've since had a number of affirmations about the truth of the Book of Mormon, but it began simply with me believing my father. I used to join him in the evenings as he would lean over his drafting table and work on many of dozens of maps that he put together in full color. Some of his maps he put together were 4 feet by 4 feet, and they were taken from military photographs provided in World War II. In his most recent book, he's done the best he could in terms of locating the different cities, most of which I agree with. But because of new findings since he wrote his last book, which was in 2002, some of the names of the sites have been rearranged. For example, he has Ammonihah on his map in his book, sort of in the south central part of Meso America. And we know from translation of glyphs now that Ammonihah is the same as the city of Tonina, and Tonina is west and north of Zarahemla. So that's changed from his map, which he just wasn't aware of those glyph translations at the time he was trying to label each of the cities. But he made 8 trips to Mesoamerica, and he got interested and wanted to have some type of certification that what he was doing was correct. So after he retired, he went back to school, and as Paul mentioned, they were classmates together. He got a degree from the University of Kansas, majoring in archaeology. He's written 3 editions to his book, Voices from the Dust. The first edition was in 1996, then in 1999. The last edition was in 2002. And as of about 2015, he had assembled another 600 pages of handwritten notes and had gone through 85 books and highlighted them to try and bring up to date the most recent findings as of 2015. However, he got to be 100, and he told my brother and I, boys, I've written enough. I'm 100 years old. I'm tired of writing. If you want to finish it, go ahead. So he left us with all those notes. And so since his passing away, we have contributed to the Book of Mormon Foundation here in Independence 400 of his books regarding the Book of Mormon, and 4 a file cabinet, a 4-drawer file cabinet full of his files and notes that he had made getting ready for the 4th edition of his book. But all those notes and files and books are now in the possession of the Book of Mormon Roundtable on White Oak and Independence. And the good thing about that, it's a non-lending library. So people can go to that library and check out any of those things, spread it out on the big table that they've got in the center of one of their rooms and examine it. But then they have to put it back before they leave. That way we know that that material won't go missing or be stolen. In his book, for those who've had a chance to look at it, it's full of colored drawings. And some of the unique things about the colored drawings are, he wanted to be able to use some drawings out of the National Geographic magazine. So he got a hold of them and said, can I use your drawings in my book? And they said no. And he said, can I reproduce those drawings? I'm an artist. Can I draw those drawings in my book just like they appear in your photographs? And they said, well, yes, if you want to do that, go ahead. And so a number of the art drawings that are in his book are actually his artistic reproduction of the photographs that appear in National Geographic. He's got, I think, 4 from the National Geographic, and then he's also borrowed and got permission to use other people's drawings, which he's included in his book. It also includes a number of 2-page colored maps, which make it very easy to go ahead and examine Mesoamerica and see where things are located. In his book, one of the chapters in his book is revised positions. And so it's what things have people learned since he wrote his first book. And he's included several of them. I want to mention, though, that he didn't have the opportunity to include LIDAR in his most recent book because LIDAR didn't come out until about 4 years ago. And he stopped writing back in 2002. So he missed the opportunity to use LIDAR as one of the new developments. If you're not familiar with that, that's laser radar, which mounts its image off of the topography. It goes through the jungle and actually goes down to the land that's underneath it. Since the development of LIDAR, National Geographic and archaeologists in general have said we've had to completely rewrite our description of Mesoamerica because it has showed us so many new things that we are not aware of. For example, hundreds of miles of roads, hundreds of cities, and fortress locations So many things have been discovered today which have been proven because of LIDAR, which archaeologists now have to accept. One of the other chapters, well, one of many chapters in this book, are easy assumptions, and he begins with one of the easy assumptions is to assume that the Mormon Hill Cumorah celebration is actually the location of Hill Cumorah that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon. It just can't be. If you think about it for a moment, one is, if it were the real Hill Cumorah that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon, don't you suppose that the LDS would have found something as they dug up that hill? Because you know they have. That hill is literally a hill, but the Hill Cumorah in the Book of Mormon was the site of 220,000 families of Nephites who were assembled. That takes a lot of geography to be able to handle 220,000 families. And so he points out that the Hill Cumorah in New York, that never was called Hill Cumorah by Joseph Smith, by the way, that the Hill Cumorah in New York is where, in fact, Moroni buried the plates, but it isn't where the final battle was held. Evidences, by the way, of the final battle being held at Hill Cumorah in Meso America is that if you were to dig down about 2,000 years, really about 1,400 years of dirt, you find a large field of battle implements that spread out over many acres. And then if you dig down another 600 years, you find another layer of battle implements, which is certainly suggested evidence of major battles having occurred at that site. And can you imagine two armies, one of which was at least 250,000 and the other twice that big, traveling 4,000 miles to have their final battle? It just doesn't make sense. So Dad believed that Hill Cumorah was in Meso America, not in New York. Another easy assumption that people deals with the narrow neck of land, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Today, it's about 125 miles across. Back at the time of the Book of Mormon, when it was written, around a couple of hundred years BC, the south side of the isthmus was actually underwater. And during the upheaval that occurred at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, there was about 25 miles of land that was uplifted, and so there was no more water on that. On the north side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, there used to be tremendous marshlands that narrowed the land so that a Nephite runner could actually run across the land that was, in fact, above water in a day and a half. And so a lot of people don't want to recognize the Isthmus of Tehuantepec today because it is about 125 miles wide, and that's a pretty long run for somebody to do in a day and a half. But with the explanation that Dad was able to provide, I think it makes sense now. Another easy assumption, and this is something that not everybody agrees with my father on, but a lot of people want to start the Jaredite story about 2200 BC. My father insists that it's 3200 BC. And the way he arrived at that was he went back to what most people, most archaeologists anyway, would agree that the Genesis began at about 4600 BC. And so if you use that as the starting date and then just keep track of the generations that occurred since Adam and move forward, the Jaredites left the tower then at about 3200 BC rather than 2200. That will become important as people study the historical sense of the Book of Mormon after that. I might also point out, this is not in my father's book, but is something that I've become aware of in trips that I've made to Meso America myself. There is such a thing as a radioactive volcano. Now, that may sound humorous, but there is proof of radioactive volcanoes existing around the world. The University of Honduras is conducting a study as to whether or not there are radioactive or were radioactive volcanoes in the Mexican Valley. And if there were, it would certainly explain the age difference that we find, because the more radioactivity you have, the more interference there is with carbon dating, and the less radioactivity you have, the less interference there is. And so as you get further away from the most of the volcanic activity that occurred in the Mexican Valley, you find that the dates begin to coincide with the Book of Mormon dates. Another thing which I found interesting in terms of studying dates is that with the carbon dating capability of coming up with dates, archaeologists accepted that there were two major dates, two different dates that they could accept for the history of the ancient Americans and their ruins. Both dates were acceptable to them. Both dates could be proven, but they couldn't use both dates. So they flipped a coin. It just so happened that we were unlucky because the coin came down with the dates that were furthest away from what's in the Book of Mormon. But if it had flipped heads instead of tails, the dates would be much closer to what's in the Book of Mormon, which is one of the areas of contention for people that don't want to believe in the book. Another thing Dad pointed out is the Chinese connection between the Jaredites and the people that live in China today. And in fact, one of the major professors in China today has come over to Mexico and been able to translate Jaredite records because they look so much like Chinese records. And if you consider that the Jaredites probably traveled through, and this is my father's contention, that after the fall of the tower, the Jaredites traveled east through China and actually left China to sail across the ocean to arrive on the west coast of Mexico. But it's interesting to note that there's appears to be a real connection between the Chinese and the ancient Jaredite records. Dad also began to point out that there were really there was a lot of metal work in Meso America. We're certainly aware of gold and silver and copper, but in addition to that, there was a good deal of metal work in iron. And while that may be contested by some, they have a hard time trying to justify how come all the iron smelting locations are found where it was obvious that iron was smelted. And nobody disagrees that that's what they were, but they can't make the connection between, well, if they were able to smelt iron, then they must have been able to work with it. But that doesn't seem to make sense to people that don't want to acknowledge metal in Mesoamerica. Another thing which Dad was right on the cutting edge of, because he happened to be at one of the major archaeological conferences where this was exposed or revealed. The anti-Nephi Lehis, who were converted, from Ammon, moved to the land of Jershon in the Book of Mormon.
Oh, I've lost the audio. Is that me or him?
Can anybody else hear me?
Yeah, we're hearing you fine, Eric. I think it must be something with your computer, Monty.
Yeah, I'm hearing.
Okay. One of the really wonderful things that archaeologists have discovered is that the pottery that was found now in Jershon is identical with the pottery that was produced in the upper highlands where the Lamanites lived. And so the archaeologists have agreed that there had to have been a migration from the upper highlands to Jershon, which is the lower part of Belize on the east side of the Yucatan Peninsula. And they agreed that there was, in fact, a migration as proven by the identity of the pottery that was developed in both sites. Dad just happened to be at that conference when that was revealed and announced, and so he included that in his book. One of the things that Dad only touched on briefly, and had he continued writing instead of giving it up, was the use of the wheel. The Mayans were fully aware of the wheel, as evidenced by wheels on a lot of their toys. But the reason that Mayans didn't use wheels in transportation of goods is that it was more efficient to use humans. And let me explain that for a moment. If you take, let's say, a normal wagon with 4 wheels on it, that will probably weigh at least 200 pounds for that wagon, and you pile a bunch of stuff on the top of that wagon, let's say you get the weight up now to 1,000, it would take like 10 humans, because they didn't have beasts of burden, it would take 10 humans to pull that loaded wagon. Whereas, so that was like 100 pounds per human pulling a wagon. What the Mayans found is by strapping a weight on their back and fastening it over their forehead, they could carry 125 pounds each, which was much more efficient than relying on humans pulling a wagon. So they deliberately didn't use the wheel, although they were very familiar with it. They used highways, and my father was well aware of highways, sock bays as they call them today. But one of the things about highways, which we've since found, which is particularly interesting, is when they were built in their original state, they typically were built 3 feet off the ground. I mean, they were 3 feet thick, so that the top of the highway was 3 feet above the ground. They actually were 4 lanes. They had 2 lanes in each direction, 1 lane for slow commerce travelers and another lane for fast message carriers. When they intersected, they actually had traffic circles so that the fast runners could move through without being held up by the slow commerce carriers. This is something that was found since my dad finished his book, but is now available through the findings of LIDAR. Something else that Dad focused on in his book was Hebrewisms. There's a lot of, if you're not familiar with that, the Book of Mormon is written in a Hebrew style. And while it was criticized for his poor English, once they found out that it was Hebrew style, they found out that it was perfect Hebrew style, even if it was poor English. Fortunately, he had a close friend, Angela Kroll, who some of you may recall, who was getting her PhD in Hebrew, who was able to identify the Hebrewisms and help Dad put that in his book and keep it accurate. Dad accepted assistance from a number of people that were familiar with the Book of Mormon, who some of you may recall. He received assistance from Ray Treat and Angela Kroll and Paul Ludy. And he also got permission from Robert Farley to use some of his photographs, which he was able to produce 100%. He didn't have to draw those photographs. Robert Farley allowed him just to reproduce the photographs in his book. Anyway, Dad worked on those books for years and years. And one of my favorite memories is being able to sit at his knee, if you will, while he was working on drawings and maps that went along with the Book of Mormon. So it was a real wonderful experience for me. And I never had any doubt regarding the validity of the Book of Mormon because my father told me it was true and I believed him. So there's a brief summary. I'm happy to try and answer questions now, so go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. I also admired your father. He was a remarkable scholar and good friend. As a matter of fact, he and his wife and you 3 brothers took in a little girl named Teparotu Rina Faura. And when she first came to the United States, if I recall correctly, your dad was unemployed at the time. And so to have a guest come in the door unexpected was a bit of a shock. But you guys treated her nicely, and that little girl ended up marrying me and staying here for 53 years. So the fact that she got acquainted with my second cousin's family well before she got acquainted with me is rather an interesting irony and mystery as well. But thank you for that kindness that you shared with Rena.
Another piece of trivia kindness, Paul, which I've shared with you before. On one weekend when my folks visited your parents in Lamoni, we stayed at the farm overnight. You took me out on a tractor and taught me how to drive, and that's where I learned. So thank you.
Well, now he drives a sports car, so the tractor has evolved. Well, Eric, I want to go back to that founding date because Glenn and I had the conversation about what caused the Olmec to establish the date of August 13, 3114 BC as the beginnings of their calendar. What significant event could have happened at that time in terms of human history? As a history teacher, I was searching for things in Egypt, things in Sumer, things in the Mediterranean, things in China, India. Where in the world was there anything that was going on that would make it so that August 13th of 3114 BC would be the significant date for establishing the beginning of the calendar? Because, I mean, it could possibly have been arbitrary. But on the other hand, for something so significant as the beginning of a calendar, you commonly want to commemorate something significant. And while we don't do a real good job of it, we refer to the time of Christ, BC and AD, and so we use the time of Christ as a very significant marker in our horrible calendar today. I call it a horrible calendar because we are currently we're celebrating an ancient tyrant, Julius, and next month we move to his nephew, who is an even worse tyrant, and then we follow that with September, the 7th month, in the 9th month place. Then we go to October, the 8th month, in the 10th month's place. And then we go to November, the 11th month, in the 9th month, in the 11th month's place. And finally, we get to my birthday in December, which is actually the 12th month's place. And so, in order to celebrate these two ancient tyrants, these horrible human beings, we throw off our calendar half a year. And it's just absurd to me that we would do that. But at least we do commemorate the Christ back in the middle of it. So I can be a little bit forgiving in that respect. But nonetheless, Glenn and I had this conversation. What would have happened? And we agreed. And I'm delighted that you're here to be able to address the matter as well. We agreed that the prospect that this was the date of the Olmec Jaredite discovery of America was a good possibility.
Yeah, and remember that their trip across China took a lot of years. It wasn't an overnight trip at all. So from the time that the tower fell to the time that they left China and then sailed across the ocean, that was a long period of time.
Well, and furthermore, we've had a couple of presentations from Blair Bryant, who identifies, what is it, 7 or 8 different Xi'an, Xian, cities in China that apparently carry the name of Zion, in which case they may well have been settled by migrants who are looking for the promised land. Rather interesting coincidence, but again, reinforcing your father's thesis. So I don't know if Blair and Glenn ever had any interaction, but I'm confident the two of them would have been cohorts on that issue.
One of the things I might mention about Blair, he has sent me copies of his translations, and they're so obvious and so simple. I found that I have been able to write messages using that language, or so I give some credibility to what he's come up with due to that fact.
Well, he's currently in the process of teaching his class on it, and I agree that that it's really Well, it's not an easy thing to try to translate or transcribe, but when you begin to understand the difficulty of being able to present characters that will communicate cross-culturally, then it's a remarkable, beautiful, magnificent effort. And his efforts to help us understand it is really helpful. And I agree. The open portal, the by way of, he calls it, the doorway, um, is the open portal that my wife has come back to me to remind us is always open for joy.
One of the disagreements that my father and I had over his book was the location of the city of Nephi. And it's my contention that there's a city of Nephi and a city of Nephi-Lehi. And he's pointed out that there's much evidence that the city of Kumanauhuyu is the city of Nephi, which I agreed with. But there's another city, Chincoteague, which has all the characteristics of the city of Nephi as described in the Book of Mormon. And so, for example, the hidden passage in particular, but having made that observation and showed that to my father, he said, well, there could have been other cities with hidden passages. So my comment back to him was, why don't you try and find support for how there could be two cities rather than only one? And he never followed up on that before he died.
Okay, we have other hands, and so I'm going to turn it over to Deb to try to keep people in line. Hopefully those that are waving their hands can be seen as well. Typically, she keeps the queue in good order. Yep.
Thanks, Paul. We got Rick first and then Blair. Please go ahead, Rick.
Okay, thanks, Glenn, for
I
presenting.
just lost Debbie.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay. What's fascinating about that part of the Book of Mormon and Ether is that it demonstrates that they had a foreknowledge that God was going to change their language. And we don't get that from the Bible, that they had foreknowledge, and then he prayed. The brother Jared said, well, I guess Jared, the brother Jared, said, go and pray and ask God not to mess with our language and not to mess with our friends' language either, so that we can communicate with each other. So they had to have foreknowledge, advanced warning that something was going to happen to disturb the languages. So my next question is that I have Voices from the Dust right here, and it doesn't have color. If I give you a box of crayons in this book, can you color it for me?
Well, his 2002 edition is fully colored.
Okay. How can I get a 2002 edition?
If you would write the Richard Price Bookstore in Independence, Missouri, which is located on 23rd Street,
Yeah.
they have copies available.
Yeah. Okay. I was there not too long ago and I didn't see it, but I wasn't really looking for it. I was looking for some other books. So
I've had other people say the same thing, and I had to point out to them, it's because the extra copies are in the basement, not up on their shelves.
oh, they hide them.
Yeah.
They hide them in the dust.
Right.
Okay. I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Boyd, well, actually, Blair, you had your hand up. Did you change your mind again?
No,
You want to ask your question?
it just disappeared, I guess.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
Eric, I appreciate your comments. And I did share
Your son is attempting to reach you on your cellular device.
that my presentation on the Jaredite journey across China was highly influenced by Eric Scott. He told me about the Zungarian Gap, and I included that in my presentation. For Eric, for your benefit, Paul mentioned the cities in Xi'an area. Within 100 miles of Xi'an, which is that central capital area in China, there are over 10 different cities that have subtitles of Xi'an.
Wait a few hours after run their
Uh,
credit again.
I didn't know that.
Well, I found them on maps and started searching for them then. I don't know where I found that map. I have been unable to go back to it and locate the map that had them on it. I got it off the web somewhere and I copied that. So there are at least 10 areas that have a variation of Xi'an. And I believe that is an indication that those people knew of the story of Zion and that they settled there it's in the Yellow River area of China. And I believe that they came down the Yellow River and went out to the China Sea, where they eventually built their barges across the ocean. So I just wanted to let you know what I had presented to them on that. Thank you for the Hungarian Gap story.
Does everybody know the Hungarian Gap story? If you don't, let me just point out, you can Google that. It's spelled Dzungarian. You can Google it and actually see the section of mountain that was removed. You can still see it on Google.
Okay. Boyd, looks like you're next, and then Monty. Go ahead, please, Boyd.
Hello, Eric. I appreciate your presentation. It's quite interesting. I have a question. The pyramids in Meso America, what is your father's view of their function and their relationship to the Book of Mormon people?
Well, as a start, archaeologists used to believe that the pyramids just were an indication of some religious center around which there was no city. But after having visited Mesoamerica a number of times, Dad discovered, along with many other archaeologists, that the pyramids were actually city centers, and around those pyramids were built oftentimes even smaller pyramids, but other temples and other commerce buildings, so that the pyramid itself was where they put a temple on top of it. It often was not a tomb, although sometimes it was, but it wasn't always a tomb. Almost always, though, there was some type of temple on top of the pyramid where they worshiped, but the pyramid was typically the center of the commerce in town. Now, El Mirador has got a number of pyramids, one which is larger than the rest, but it has a number of large pyramids, and many other Mesoamerican ruins have got multiple pyramids in them, but nearly always the largest one has got a temple on top of it. And the others served different functions, like at Chichen Itza, for example, they have an astronomy tower on top of it where they could watch the stars and keep track of them. And another at Mayapan, which is an upper northwest corner of the Yucatan Peninsula, the largest pyramid is an observation point for looking out over the countryside and seeing if there's any enemies coming. So the pyramids had a number of different functions, but typically they were the center of commerce in a city.
Okay, thank you much.
Okay. Monty, go ahead, please.
Where do they speculate that the Jaredites landed? when they came to the southern continent?
Well, let me turn to my father's map and I'll tell you. If you were to draw a line from Mexico City due south until it intersects with the Pacific Ocean, the Jaredites landed about 50 miles west of that. So it would be up the coast, north and west. So again, think of Mexico City, go due south to the Pacific Ocean, and then take a jog 50 miles up the coast going west, and that's about where the Jaredites landed.
I really, oh, go ahead.
Their largest city, however, was over on the East Coast, even though that was where their original city was. Something else we found this is just something I can share with you personally. And one of the last trips that I was down visiting, I was visiting a particular ruin. This ruin happened to be Chincoteac, and all the Mayan ruins there were built with 125-pound stones that were all the same size, and they were that weight because that's how big, that was the maximum weight one of their workers could carry. But the Mayan ruins had all these relatively small stones. On the same site were some humongous stones. I mean, like as big as a Volkswagen or as big as a Cadillac. And those stones were stones that were put in place by Jaredites. And so it was always fascinating to me whenever you go to visit a site, if you see really huge stones as part of the makeup, that probably was put there by Jaredites because the Mayans always used the smaller stones that were small enough that a human being could pick one up and carry it.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. Your father sounds like he was a very interesting man to listen to. My father, about the only comment he had about me was that I was so lazy, I needed a cat under each arm to do my breathing for me. And I say he'd turn over in his grave right now because I use a CPAP machine to help me breathe at night. So maybe he was seeing something prophetical.
Well, go back, Monty, if you would please, on that question. And how did the Jaredites move those larger stones?
Oh, I tell you, I've heard all kinds of speculation on that, from various different types of engineering feats to aliens coming in and lifting them with an anti-gravity beam and putting them where they wanted them. So I don't think anybody really knows. And there have been some pretty good engineering uh, theory, voiced with regard to them, but that's about it. I mean, my knowledge of archaeology is so sketchy. I mean, the only holes I ever dug was to look for night crawlers. And
well, Dad
so,
never expressed an opinion regarding how did they move those big stones.
So what do you think?
me?
I'm asking Eric.
Okay.
Well, this will probably sound silly, but I think they had some divine assistance.
Either that or they invented some very big wheelbarrows.
Yes. We know that a lot of times big things were moved with the use of levers and rollers. But I don't know how they got the particular stones I'm thinking of were about 6 feet off the ground, and I don't know how they got them up that high. Certainly, it was way more than any one or two people could lift. I don't know. I suppose if 100 people got around it, they might be able to lift it, but I really don't know. I've been puzzled by that all my life.
So I was visualizing Easter Island when you were talking about the large statuary that's been moved, because lately I've heard,
Yeah, on Easter Island.
yeah. Oh, I'll let somebody else talk here.
Okay. Before we get to the questions, Val has a comment in the chat. Was the Jaredite landing in Acapulco, Mexico? That seems to be 50 miles northwest of the point where a line south from Mexico City intersects with the Pacific.
That's about right.
Okay. All right. Then David Ferryman is next, and Boyd follows him. Go ahead, David.
Before I ask my question, I just want to quickly state that if you have a group of people who are able to use faith to move mountains, and in the book of Jacob, it says they were able to speak and even the trees obeyed them, I don't think we should be embarrassed about the idea of miraculous intervention to move large things. So just want to throw that out there real quick. But my question is, and I'm not like huge into Book of Mormon archaeology, but one question I've had since I was a little kid is, if the Book of Mormon says that they built a temple like unto Solomon's, except not, without all the gold and precious things, it seems like there's a lot of pyramids. Why do we find so many pyramids and not enough temples like Solomon? Is that because, do you think that was what the Jaredites built and Nephites just moved into them? Why the switch from the one type to the other? And is there any archaeological evidence of Israelite temple structures in North or South America or Central America?
Well, frequently that many of their temples, whether they were on top of pyramids or not, consisted of 3 rooms. There was an outer room that sort of wrapped around. Picture a C laying on its side so that the 2 legs of the C are pointing up. There was an outer room sort of in the shape of a C, although it was square, not rounded. Then there was a center room. And then there was finally a third room, which was completely surrounded by the other 2 rooms, much smaller, that was considered to be like the Holy of Holies at Solomon's Temple. And because of their Jewish background, it's been speculated that indeed that's just what those 3 rooms represented, was a temple with the Holy of Holies in it. Usually they were on top of pyramids because that gave them prominence, where the whole community could see it and the whole community could give reference to the temple that was located there.
Okay, looks like, David, did you have anything else?
No, that was it. Thank you. That makes sense.
All right, Boyd, go ahead, please.
Eric, another question here for you. Did your dad, does he view the Olmec Empire was there, the Jaredites?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if I understand right, those stones that are down there, they have features that are more like the blacks of Africa and all that. Is there a relationship there? Did he discover? Any idea why that is?
Could you repeat that? I didn't catch all of it.
The features that are on a lot of statues amongst the Olmecs, they look more Negroid.
Oh, well, there's a major archaeological theory that the Jaredites were Negroes. My father didn't render an opinion on that, but he did show pictures in his book of there being 3 different facial styles among the Olmecs. One was very Negroid with the big lips. One was very Polynesian, and one was very European. And they had large large stones. I'm trying to think of a better way to describe it, that were carved to represent those three different facial styles. And he shows those, by the way, in his book. And next to the stones, he's got pictures of African Negro, a Polynesian, and a European face of modern days, so that you can see how closely they represented what was carved there. This is an archaeological side story you might be interested in. On those huge stones that are the Olmec stones, which they think are heads of kings, they have on the back of the stones.
If you'll notice, Rick is showing the picture that you're referring to, Eric, with the up-to-date things.
Good. On the big, this is sort of a side story. On the great big stones, where there's like 4 or 5 of them, the giant heads, pardon me. On the back of one of those stones, at least, there was a history of the Jaredite kings. It's written in a language called Ogam, which is a alphabet that was used by many different cultures. Just like we use the same alphabet the Germans do and the same alphabet that the Spanish do, but they use different words than we do, but we do share the same alphabet. Well, Ogam is an alphabet that was shared by many ancient cultures, including the Olmec. They wrote on the back, at least of one of these heads, a history of the kings that had been over the Jaredite nations. Neil Steedy, who worked on that site that I'm referring to, made the translation and presented it to his superiors or his bosses. And during the time that he was there, one of the workers came out and chipped off that Olmec translation so that you couldn't read it. Fortunately, Neil had taken photographs of it. So after they put that guy in jail, they reconstructed the Ogam history of the Jaredite kings on the back of that particular statue. But it does kind of show some of the things that some archaeologists, the steps they'll go to protect their own, their theory, their pet theory. At the city of Copan, for example, which is just over the border in Guatemala, in Honduras, we have original drawings of the original explorers that came through of elephants at the top of some of their glyphs. Later, archaeologists came through and said there can't have been elephants here, so they chipped off the tusks. But fortunately, the original drawings show that there really were elephants drawn at the top of the. But that gives you an idea of some of the things that, some of the steps that archaeologists will go to protect their own private theory.
So those, you say those are the kings of the Jaredites on the back of that statue, and
yes,
the names match the ones that's in the Book of Mormon?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eric.
Now, that's not in my father's book. That's something I happen to be aware of just because of my studies of archaeology.
Rick, if you'll hold that picture up again, please. And for the rest of you, if you'll right click on Rick's picture, on Rick's square, and click the pin option, you'll be able to see what Rick is showing you. Your pages have turned. Rick, grab that page and fold it. There you go.
I had to let go to click my audio. Is this the page you're talking about, Eric?
What page? Yes.
Colossal
I've got
head.
something blocking it, but I saw enough of the picture. Yes, that's the page.
Yeah.
What page number is that?
29.
Wow, 28.
That was close.
You were very close. How did you guess so good? Do you have this book memorized?
No.
Yeah, these are the colossal heads, I think was the word you were looking for, Eric.
Yes,
Colossal.
thank you.
So I don't know how long you want me to hold it.
That's good.
Okay.
David, how do I get out of that now?
Unmute. Right click again and it'll tell you to remove pin.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Thanks. Thank you. I learned something new.
I'm afraid to clear up the picture of my screen for fear that I'll screw up the audio, which I had such a hard time getting.
Okay, so Rick, did you have a question?
No, I didn't. I just had an image, another image. Up there at the top of my Book of Mormon is the plan of the top of Chichen Itza, as Eric was talking about, the letter C on its side, like that. And then you come in from the other side, and there's one room and then another room. And maybe this was like a reproduction of Solomon's temple of the holy place and the Holy of Holies at the top of Chichen Itza.
Hmm.
Is that what you were talking about, Eric?
Yes.
Okay.
Cool.
That's it.
Thanks for sharing, Rick.
And Rick, that was true on top of a lot of pyramids, not just at Chichen Itza.
Whoops, you muted, Rick.
I haven't gotten around like you have, Eric. My dad was not an archaeologist. He was a machinist.
Well, I was very lucky.
Yeah, you were blessed.
Okay, Blair, go ahead, please.
Eric, you told me, you told us about your father being at a conference in pottery from two different cities. As I heard the story before, I want to know if this is your understanding. That he was at the conference, there were two different presentations being made about the pottery. Your father recognized they were the same. One of them, the pottery stopped very suddenly, and the other one, it started very suddenly and about the same period of time. And that indicated the move of the anti-Nephi Lehis to another city.
Yes.
Was that other city Lamani?
Well, it was actually throughout. It wasn't just Lamani. That was one of the cities, but a number of cities in Belize had the same pottery.
Altenhoon, for example?
Now, I'm not looking at a map, so I'm assuming you're right.
It's very close to Lamani. I've been to Altenhoon. The Lamani tour was not available when I was there, so I went to Altenhoon. I associated that with that location, so that would be the anti-Nephi Lehis that moved there. And I appreciate your experience with your father. I had similar experiences with my father and mother about the Book of Mormon, and I too was told that the Book of Mormon was true, and I believe. Still do. Thank
So
you.
do I.
Okay, Kenneth, go ahead, please.
Okay, I have a couple things. A lot of times, these scientists talk about millions of years. At least they don't, or on this number, they're not talking about all that big amount of time. Another thing, I'm on a picture where if somebody speaks and someone's showing something, the person that speaks, that's what I see. In other words, I don't see the picture. I'll say about that much.
So do you mean, Kenneth, are you only seeing the person when they're talking?
Yes.
Okay, so that would be on how you're viewing. But you're on a phone, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you're on a phone. Yeah. Oh, it got quiet.
Well, let me jump back in then. You mentioned the metalworks, and yes, there's a good deal of agreement about the silver, gold, and copper, but there's been so much dispute over ferrous metals. And if I recall correctly, your father identified several smelting sites of ferrous metals and had several examples of iron that had survived. Yet, because iron oxidizes so completely over 1,000 years or even 100, then there's been that very little of that that actually has been retained from the Book of Mormon period. But perhaps you can identify for us some of the evidences that he had of metals, of ferrous metals that he had at the time.
They don't come to mind, but I can make reference to you regarding metal. One of the current day arguments against the Book of Mormon is nobody wrote on metal plates. Well, just recently, Rick and I in our Book of Mormon class looked up and found over 100 references to records being recorded on metal plates throughout the world. So there's really ample proof of metal plates being used for recording records. Another thing regarding that comes up regarding the use of metal, one of the metals probably used was something called tubaga. And tubaga is something which is actually used today by jewelers. It's it's a gold alloy, and if you'll recall, Joseph Smith said that the plates had the appearance of gold. He didn't say they were solid gold. And a lot of people have wondered and argued about if the plates were in fact solid gold. You're talking about probably a 200 or 300 pound chunk of metal that Moroni had to haul all the way up to New York, which would be really more than a human could do. With the use of tubaga, which is an alloy, which could be spread over copper, as a for instance, and that's typically what it's spread over to make it look like gold. You can actually make indentations on the alloy, and the plate, the resulting plate that looks like gold because of the alloy that's over the top of the copper, weighs much, much less than a solid gold plate. And so using the detail in the Book of Mormon about how or in church history, how big the plates were in terms of height and width and depth, the current estimate is as if tubaga had been used over the plates of copper, it probably would have weighed about 40 pounds, which is something that a person could carry, although inconvenient. And that's about the last of my metal knowledge.
Let me pick up on the sizing factor there, because I have just put together, assembled at the Joseph Smith, the third site in Lamoni, a combination that allows a person to see the print of the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon published in Nauvoo. And that's where we found the type last year and the year before, the little 3.4 point type that is 2 millimeters per letter. And I mean, it's so small, but when Ebenezer Robinson went to get it copied, he had it in his hip pocket. The Book of Mormon was in his hip pocket. So we're talking here about a comparatively small book that the Book of Mormon composed when it was very early in its composition. In 1892, in Lamoni, the large print edition of the Book of Mormon was published, and the contrast is amazing. You can actually read it. Unfortunately, there are very few copies of it that have survived. There weren't a whole lot of copies made in the first place, but I have those two juxtaposed so that a visitor can see the 1840 edition, see how tiny those words are, and then compare that with the 1892 edition, which, by the way, was published, at least at one point, as the two records. The first record was the Book of Mormon in large print, and the second was the inspired version of the New Testament in large print. So we actually have one of those extremely rare two records books on display at the Joseph Smith site, and I'm particularly pleased for people to be able to see the contrast between the print of the 1840 edition compared to 1892. So when you're talking about how big was the print on the plates, it really does make a difference on how fine the writing skills.
Okay. Let's see. Kenneth, I see your hand. You will be after Monty. Monty, go ahead, please.
What was the name of that medal that was, an obscure name? I'm trying to think of it, but everybody's been trying to figure out what it was.
Tumbaga.
Huh?
Tumbaga.
Okay.
Or Tumbago. There's a variation in spellings.
But the difference in weight, the way it is, it seems to me like it's got maybe some of the properties of titanium, but carving on it would be very difficult. Titanium is a pretty complex smelting process. It requires a total lack of oxygen, and so you have to have a special forge set up for it and everything. But I was just trying to figure out, what that was.
I can put the spelling in the chat if you want.
Thank you.
Okay. Kenneth, go ahead, please.
Okay. There is also internal evidences of the Book of Mormon coming from plates called the Noah racers. There's one in I know of that's in the Alma 14th chapter, which talks about bearing their weapons. First they say bearing the weapons of peace. Well, there is no such thing. And then he corrects himself. But then by saying, but the weapons of war for peace. So if Joseph Smith was just writing it on a piece of paper, he wouldn't have it like that. He would just gone straight to they buried their weapons of war for peace without anything like that. So that is a proof that the Book of Mormon, it comes from some plates. I'll say about that much.
Thank you, Kenneth. Blair, go ahead, and then Rick.
Eric, you brought up Eric's Steedy. He, I know, was down there in Mexico, and they had pulled a stela out of the ground that was purposely, obviously done, packed dirt or sand around it, and lava came in, and it's some, 16 feet or something that they were going to pull out of there. Did you get in on what happened to that?
Yes. The stela that you're talking about was at a city that had 16 stela out in a square, and the city was covered over by lava. And when the people saw the lava coming, they packed dirt around this particular stela, sandy clay, which was impervious to the lava, and surrounded it so when the lava came in, it would be held away from the stela itself by the clay. And they took the clay up within 3 feet of the top, and the lava actually came over, clear over the top of the thing, but it only covered up 3 feet of the stela because the rest of it was protected by the sandy clay. Later, Neil was aware of the fact that through he claims divine intervention, they located that stela and told people they should dig down 3 feet at where X marks the spot. And they did, and they found this stela, and they dug around it to the extent that they can. They have not pulled it out yet. One of the problems of pulling it out is it's surrounded by rocks that are afraid it will fall into the hole and damage the stela. So at the moment, the stela is still in the hole. We're still waiting on the Mexican government to give authority to pull the stela out and see how it reads all the way down to the bottom, because right now you can only get a camera down 2 sides of the stela, and you can't actually see what's on the backside with a camera. So we're very hopeful that the government will soon give permission to pull that out. I think there's enough money on hand through contributions to pay for a crane to actually do the pulling. And the Mexican government has already agreed that they would relocate the stela in front of the National Museum on the ground. But unfortunately, it hasn't been pulled out yet and still waiting for authority.
Wow. Thank you.
Okay, Rick and then Ron.
Okay, I'll be quick. Eric was reading this book the other day. It's called Lost Secrets of Maya Technology. And it's got I don't think this is it's just archaeologists. I don't think he has any religious intention, but it shows a furnace, like an iron smelting furnace, illustrated. And then Eric was talking about how they carried items on their back with the tum line. And lastly, how the highways were built up above the ground to prevent them from flooding and being washed out. So that's it. If anybody's interested in picking it up, it was only like $9 on a used book site.
Thank you. Okay, Ron Smith, go ahead. Good evening.
Good evening. I got in quite late, and sorry about that. But I wanted to pick up on what was said about the weight of the plates. The 600 pounds is way out of the ballpark for the size of plates. They were the description says they were 6 inches by 6 inches by 8 inches, and if that's anywhere close, a cubic foot of gold weighs 1,206 pounds. And what happened was that people say, well, that's almost half, 6 inches is like half. And so they've divided the 1,206 by half. But what you have to do is divide it by 8, and you get 150 pounds. Or if you actually take the 6 inches as a half a foot and the 8 inches as 2/3 a foot, you get much more exact figure of 201 pounds. And that's the maximum that you could have for it. But they also said that it was like tin, and you could rustle it with your fingers. So a lot of that it wasn't solid. I mean, and my mom wrote an article on the weight of the plates a long time ago, because that was one of the big things that some of the folks were having against the Book of Mormon plate story, was that the weight was too much for anybody to have carried around. But anyway, so if it was solid gold, it would have been 201 pounds. And
I have no argument with that.
So just thought I'd throw that in, because that was something that a lot of people had thrown out, and some people have believed and thrown out the story because of that. So.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Okay, Earl Watt, go ahead, please.
I find this is a very stimulating discussion tonight. So thank you, Eric. What's often bothered me is they talk about the plates of gold. Gold is very, very soft. I've got a for the 24-karat ring, and I can bend it with my fingernails. And so if he was solid gold and they were written on there, they had to be awfully careful with those plates because gold is soft. It's not hard enough to write on.
You're certainly right. Fortunately, there are records of there are examples of people recording on gold plates throughout the world. Not many. There's like 3 or 4 specific instances where they have found records being recorded on gold plates. So it is possible. That doesn't take away what you said, though, about gold being very soft, and you'd have to be very careful with them.
It appears opportune for me to jump in again. I had a professor at when I was at La Universidad de las Americas, Professor Charles Mann, who had been involved with some government activities among Native peoples, and in one case he was supplying wheelbarrows for I believe the Mije and Zapotec in southern Mexico to build a road, and the government officials basically dropped them off and expected to be used. And Charles Mann, the anthropologist, got there and discovered that they had taken the wheels off and were carrying the wheelbarrows on their back. Because that way they could use those wheelbarrows effectively to carry more dirt and more rock. The floor is open, ladies and gentlemen. Opportunity for more questions and comments. It is approaching, it's 9:30, and so we could terminate, but there's still 25 of you on the screen, and so that means should be 25 more questions for Eric here. Your father did some work on the Hebrewism, as you mentioned, and the chiasms and so forth among those. I'd be interested if you care to make any further comment about the Hebrewisms that he was identifying. What did he consider to be most?
He didn't really get into the chiasms because that's sort of like a more advanced study, and he hadn't gotten that far yet. He did get into the way sentences were constructed. And he mentions, just for the benefit of those wanting to learn, that the Hebrew language doesn't have any vowels in it. It's all consonants. And so people have to guess at what the word is sometimes, because if you insert a wrong vowel in, wrong being not the one that was intended by the writer, you can come up with a whole different meaning. But he was able to deal with that, and he used Angela Kroll to keep him straight in terms of the arrangement of words in the translation of Hebrew. But he didn't spend a whole lot of time on it because it really became more knowledgeable after he finished his last edition.
Okay, well, then let me remind people that next week we are expecting Ralph Williston. That's Rainbow Eagle's little brother, twin brother. I think they were born very close to the same time. Anyway, Ralph will be coming to share with us the Native American traditions that are scriptural. And
He's really good, by the way. I recommend him to you highly.
Thank you. And yes, the amount of material he has pulled together is awesome. He has presented a couple times previously, a couple years ago, but he's been fighting cancer and has been given a reprieve on that, and so has agreed to come in spite of the fact of his somewhat incapacitating illness. So to pray for him and pray that he is feeling up to it and able to give us a full-scale presentation will be highly desirable. But we've heard several times from his brother, Rainbow Eagle, but this is Little Eagle coming with the native traditions in the scriptures. I see Blair has his hand up again.
Blair, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. I'm not sure I should. It's regarding what you call Hebraisms. There are probably many things in Hebraisms that we don't recognize because we don't understand Hebrew. But chiasms have been bandied about, and Angie Kroll was probably the most prominent in the our LDS side, but on the LDS side, it's parroted over and over again that the Hebraisms that are in the Book of Mormon are chiasms, and that's their primary concern. I do not agree. Not that they're not chiasms. There are definitely chiasms. Not that they're not in the Book of Mormon. They're definitely in the Book of Mormon. But those chiasms are in almost all languages. And almost any book that you pick up that's well written has got chiasms in it. You can find them by simply opening the book, finding a paragraph, a lengthy paragraph or group of paragraphs talking about the same subject, and you can get chiasms out of it. I got a book about Albrecht Speer, who was a Nazi industrial man who ran the war machine of the Nazis. It was the translation, but I opened it up and I could find chiasms in that. There are chiasms in almost any book that you've got that is well written. Chiasms are not Hebraic, in my opinion. They are not limited to any language. They are an unavoidable, and you don't know they're there. In section 162 of our Doctrine and Covenants, given in, 2002, something like that, by Grant McMurray, I found chiasms in there, 25 chiasms in that one document. In section 76, it talks about the revelations of the eternity. There are chiasms in it. Any well-written book has got chiasms in it. It's a way that the human mind works and ties things together in written form. So I really don't like to say that the chiasms are evidence of Hebraism, because while they're in Hebrew, they're in every language. It's just the way we write. Now, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Blair. Your opinion's always welcome. Boyd, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to underscore what Blair just mentioned. About 15 or so years ago, we were having a conversation online about chiasms. And there were some people that was really dead focused that chiasms were unique to Hebrew. And someone else turned around and pointed out in his own email post, he had an email post, no, email is one of these online forums or something. Anyway, he pointed out in his own statement, he did a chiasm. So, I mean, he was writing in English and he was arguing, that this is only a Hebrew feature, and he did it in his own language. So I'm with Blair on this. I don't think it's unique to Hebrew. I think I do it too. I've looked at my own writings and said, well, there's a chiasm right there. So, so I just don't think it's unique to Hebrew. It's just the way the mind works.
I think it is supportable that if you look back at the Gilgamesh epic, you'll find them there as well. That's among the earliest writings of humanity that we have that have been translated. Hey, Monty's trying to get in.
Go ahead, Monty.
My father definitely wasn't into the Book of Mormon, but fortunately for me, the Book of Mormon was. And when I read it, its testimony to my heart was that it was as acceptable a scripture as the Bible was. And I could very well walk away from it. And so that's what's kept me going. But I'm thankful that the book is able to testify in its own right for its validity and value. And I've just never had any problem with that. I'll shut up and let somebody else talk.
Thank you, Monty.
Let me invite Eric to share his testimony of what fundamentally and most succinctly, perhaps, is the message of the Book of Mormon that he treasures.
Well, I guess I treasure its message that Jesus Christ is real, that he's alive, that the stories of Jesus Christ are real, that he's a personage who is divine, that we can believe in, who answers our prayers, and he does exist.
Amen.
Thank you. That is a commonality that we seem to find across our presenters by and large, perhaps excepting the one last week who receives the book as more out of Joseph Smith's head. But on the other hand, we need to gain those perspectives too, I believe. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are at approaching 10 o'clock, and I'm going to wish you all a happy good evening. Good night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. And you're welcome to stick around and chat a little bit more, but some of us need to get to work tomorrow.
Eric? Is Eric still there? Did he leave? I guess he just left.
I sent you a late chat, Deb. This is Rick.